Hey, Retcon Raider here, back with what is now slowly becoming a quarterly series. But you know what, that's fine. Like I said last time, there's not always something to talk about. Especially these days, now that we're almost 5 years into this whole YouTube thing. Well, not quite 5 years, but we're getting there. That said, May, June, July, all pretty standard months. The numbers wiggled around a little, but we saw a pretty steady uptick of about 100, 120 new subs a month, plus about 75k views, and an average of just over 20,000 hours of watch time per month. Granted, those are some pretty anemic numbers for any serious YouTuber, but at the same time, I never really want to get to the point where I look at those sorts of numbers and feel disappointed. They really are pretty incredible when you really start thinking about it. The idea that you're bringing in hundreds or thousands of new viewers a year and racking up thousands and thousands of views and hours of watch time, even just on a monthly basis. It's easy to sort of become untethered from the reality of that and just start seeing those numbers as a raw metric that you need to surpass. I don't know, I feel like that would be the point where YouTube would stop being fun. I don't want it to ever get to the point where I'm not just playing and talking about these games because I enjoy them, but because I'm trying to surpass some imaginary goalpost that I've set for myself. On the other hand, sure, I do want the channel to be successful and, obviously to cover my overhead costs. That's important. But at the same time, I don't want it to ever feel like it's becoming a chore. I feel like I'm talking in circles now, so you get the idea. We'll just move on. Anyway, channel's still growing, slowly but steadily. Wrath is still pulling in some pretty solid numbers, and Solasta just wrapped, as evidenced by the fact that I'm doing this retro. At this point, I've kind of given up on the idea of doing the retrospectives on any sort of monthly or bi-monthly basis. Instead, I'm just doing them as it feels appropriate. It makes a good end cap for a series, not just so I can talk about that series, but also how the channel did during the time period where that series was starting to wind down. I will at least try to keep it quarterly, though. You know, I don't want to fall too behind on touching base with the viewers. In this particular case, numbers actually held pretty steady throughout the entire series. There was a slow downtick in engagement for Solasta during the last couple of weeks, but that's nothing we haven't seen before. As always, audience retention does tend to become a recurring problem for any long-running series. The higher those episode numbers get, the more daunting it is for newer viewers to work up the energy or enthusiasm to try to get into the series. Solasta was a relatively short series in the grand scheme of things, clocking in at just 38 episodes, stretched out over a 6 or 8 month period. Nothing compared to the 100-plus episodes we had for Battle Brothers, or the 60-plus episodes for Kingmaker, which we're still just barely halfway through. But even with Solasta, that is still a 30-plus hour investment to watch it from start to finish. More if you count the old pre-alpha demo, because that material was completely unique. I don't think that dungeon or that scenario were used in the final game. Regardless, I suppose the important things are that, first, Solasta never dipped into the danger zone. It did come pretty close, with a couple of those final episodes just barely topping the 1,000 view mark that I now consider the arbitrary threshold of success. In fact, episode 36 is probably the weakest performing episode of the entire series, and that one is currently sitting at just 1,060 views. But it never did dip to the point where I had to seriously consider pulling the plug, which is more than I can say about some of the other series we've done in just this past year. Chimera Squad and Gears Tactics, for example. Those were both games that I had a lot of fun playing, but they were both struggling to get above 800 views during the final stretches. And I suppose the other important thing here is that we did end up seeing it through, so that's one more completed playlist under our belt. I do feel good about that. It's always daunting when I start these long-term Let's Play projects, because there's no telling if they're going to have any sort of long-term viability. I'm generally making a soft 6 or 8 or 12-month commitment when I start these sorts of projects with no idea if the series is going to be successful enough to warrant seeing it through all the way to the end. In this particular case, it would appear that it was. Granted, not the strongest numbers I've seen. Wrath, for example, still pulls an average of about 50, sometimes even 100% better numbers per episode, but it's also not the worst. It was a fairly solid performer from start to finish, about 20% stronger than other recent series, like Chimera and Gears, and easily 2 or 3 times as strong as some of my classic series. So, that does continue to indicate that the channel is still heading in the right direction. Slowly, but surely. Anyway, I think that bit of rambling should be more than enough time for me to fit all of the boring analytics and polls and top 10 lists into the video. I think that means it's about time for us to move on to the second main thing I wanted to ramble about in this month's retrospective. And that would be more video games. A lot of y'all seem to enjoy the way I handled the last retro, especially the Retcon Raider segment. Still chewing that name, but I do like it. Obviously, I don't want every retro to become an hour-long monstrosity like that one did, but it was very satisfying to be able to finally talk about a bunch of the games I just don't normally have time to talk about. And, despite how long and awkward that retro was, the video got surprisingly strong engagement numbers, like 50 to 100% higher than the numbers I usually see on these retros, which are, and let's be honest here, really just awkward audio blogs. So, since y'all seem to like it, that's pretty much how we're going to spend the rest of this video. I've got a list of about a dozen more games I've currently got on my radar, plus a couple of games we've already talked about that I'd like to revisit. So we'll run through those, do the obligatory cat pics and special thanks, plug the Patreon, and call it a day. At the very least, that does sound more fun than whining about copyright claims and YouTube algorithms for what would almost certainly be the 80th time in a row. Those are still things that I have to deal with on a pretty regular basis, but whining about them does not make it better. Anyway, let's see what we've got on my list here. You know what? I suppose we should really start with the retreads. So we will lead with Wrath of the Righteous and Steeltown. Then we'll head into the more obscure stuff. Okay, so Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous by Owlcat Games. Obviously not a game that needs much of an introduction, given that we're currently about 40 videos deep. I will say, however, that we are coming up on the full launch pretty quickly. It's just around the corner, about a month out, on September 2nd. I am planning on continuing the beta series for now. My original plan was to actually start winding it down around now, but that was before they decided to surprise us with Beta 3. Now I'm hoping we can hit the end of Act 2 over the next few weeks, and that seems like a pretty good place to call it a finished beta series. I will note that there is still a fair amount of demand for a full launch series, though it is starting to drop off a little, since obviously a lot of folks are just watching these videos to tide themselves over until they can get their own hands on it. My current plan is to start a new full launch series when the game drops in September, and I'll be running a few polls over on Patreon to help decide exactly what sort of character we'll end up running with. Thus far, all that's really been decided is that we'll apparently be going for the Trickster path. Not quite what I was expecting. I honestly expected Lich to win the poll, but that is exactly why I run these polls in the first place. The raiders do like to keep me guessing. I guess that'll lean us into a skill-based build, maybe an arcane caster, and of course I would love to fit another animal companion in there somewhere. I'm currently test running a hasty halfling cunning scoundrel leopard rider in my spare time, but I've also got my eyes on a keen kitsune arcane rider, which might be fun. I'll hammer out all that stuff with the raiders over the next few weeks in a series of polls, but I am hoping that we'll be ready to hit the ground running once the full launch hits next month. I'll also say I don't want to commit to a full series right now, because seriously, based on current projections, that would be something like 180 episodes, and that's before the DLC they just announced. That's like a solid year's worth of videos, so Instead, I'm going to make a commitment one act at a time in about 20 or 30 episode chunks. I'll take a gander at the numbers and the interest polls as we get towards the end of each new act, and as long as it seems like it's maintaining viability, as long as there's enough demand to justify continuing to focus on it, I'll keep running with it. And if it does slow down to the point where I do feel like I need to hit the pause button, that wouldn't necessarily mean it's ending either. In that case, I might just take a break between acts, so we can do something else for a while as like a palate cleanser, before we do eventually come back to it. Essentially the same way that I'm currently treating Kingmaker, which I do also want to get back to at some point. Like I said, I think we're about halfway through that one, so we've got like 60 more episodes to go. A bit simpler, though, is Wasteland 3, Steeltown, Battle of Steeltown, from In Exile Entertainment. Again, not exactly a game I need to introduce, given that we've already run through a full 60-episode series. Not to mention, of course, the other 15 or 20 videos I did on it before that. I do have my sights set on the Steeltown X-Pack, but I will also say I've got a few misgivings based on what I'm reading about it. I'm looking forward to exploring the story, but I'm also hearing a lot of pretty harsh criticisms about persistent bugs and some of the gimmicky new mechanics. On the other hand, though, I'm also hearing that it's only about 5 or 6 hours long, and that's a mini-series we could knock out in like 2 weeks. Given general interest levels from the Raiders and rank-and-file viewers from the last quarterly poll, I think it's pretty safe to say that we are going to just bite the bullet and jump into it a little later this month. I do need to get a few other projects finished first, so it might be a couple of weeks before we get into it, but I'd definitely like to get that knocked out before we get too distracted with the Wrath launch in September. Okay, so now we're going to get into some more obscure titles. Games that I've never really talked about on the channel, but which I do keep track of in my spare time. We're not going to get too in-depth on most of these. Consider it more of an acknowledgement that I know they exist, and a shout-out for those of you who weren't aware that they existed. I'll share some general thoughts, but the main goal here is to help get them a bit more exposure, and to give you the general idea of whether or not I'm interested in them, and whether or not I might end up doing something with them in the future. First up, we've got Biosynth Rising from Neptune Games. This one is still in a pretty formative stage, with a crowdfunder coming up on Kickstarter to help get it going. It just caught my eye last month. Apparently it's going to be an isometric science fiction CRPG with turn-based tactical combat inspired by the Divinity Original Sin franchise. I guess that means barrels. We don't have a lot of details on this one just yet, since obviously it's still very early in development, but the devs have been chattering about things like directional cover, map verticality, destructible terrain, branching dialogue paths, reputation system, a lot of pretty promising features. That aside, I just really kind of like the stylized concept art that they're currently releasing. It's got a very indie retro 80s or 90s vibe to it, like the sort of art you'd expect to see on the pages of a first edition cyberpunk rulebook, or maybe something more obscure like Star Frontiers or Nightlife. Man, does anyone even remember Nightlife? That was like the prototype World of Darkness. Anyway, something to keep an eye on. And I will almost certainly end up backing that Kickstarter once it gets going. After that, we've got Book of Aliens from Thing Trunk, which obviously draws heavy inspiration from the modern XCOM franchise. This is apparently Thing Trunk's second game, after Book of Demons, which was some sort of hack-and-slash deck builder hybrid. But this one, Book of Aliens, is a much more conventional turn-based tactical game. Even just from the screenshots, we can see things like directional cover, the armor markers, and all that. You know, stuff that should be familiar to anyone who's played the Firaxis XCOMs. I am always down to play more XCOM-likes, and I really do dig that papercraft aesthetic. I don't think it's going to be a particularly deep or complex game, and honestly, that's just fine. Not everything needs to be a long-winded, soul-crushingly difficult tactical campaign. This game is not out until next year. I don't know if they're planning any sort of demo or early access builds, but I'm definitely keeping an eye on it. It looks like a fun way to kill some time. On second thought, I'm going to skip this next entry, so let's just jump to... Oh boy. Okay, next we've got Death Trash from Crafting Legends. That is quite a name. Now this one's been burning up my social media feeds for the past few weeks, because apparently the demo for it is absolutely amazing. I have not had a chance to try it out myself, but it appears to be a very irreverent post-apoc CRPG with a real-time combat system, an absolutely stunning pixel art style, and a heavy emphasis on disturbing themes and body horror. I will say, I am a little bit put off by the grotesque humor and real-time sort of Twitch-based combat system I've seen in the promo material, but I do find it very intriguing. Apparently it hits an official early access launch in just a few days on August 5th, so I'll need to make sure I set aside some time to give it a closer look before then. That said, I do have concerns about potentially objectionable content where YouTube is concerned, so that's something I'd also have to look at as well. I guess I could just cover it with party hats. After that, we've got kind of a higher profile one with Metal Slug Tactics by Lake Here Studio. I'm about 80% certain that I did not pronounce that right. Regardless, obviously this one was just announced at E3, so it is a very new addition to my watch list. Again, I'm not much of a Twitch gamer, so my exposure to the more action-oriented Metal Slug franchise is generally pretty limited, but I have gone to arcades, I've plunked some quarters into the occasional Metal Slug machine with my tech guy, and I am very pleased to see it getting this sort of tactical spin-off treatment. That's actually something I'd love to see more of. Popular action franchises getting this sort of tactical makeover. I mean, I thought Gears Tactics turned out pretty well, and I would love to see more games hopping genres like this. I would absolutely love to play Borderlands Tactics, or Mass Effect Tactics, or Fallout Tactics. No, wait. Okay, well, like a better Fallout Tactics. One that actually takes place in-universe and doesn't clash with the existing lore, which I guess would necessitate not being made by Bethesda, but let's not get into that. Anyway, Metal Slug Tactics does look like it's going to be a lot of fun. Obviously, it's going to be a simpler tactical game, likely something more akin to a puzzle game aimed at mobile devices, but that doesn't mean it won't be a fun way to kill time. I like the art, I like the concept, and I really like seeing franchises hopping genres like this. I hope it works out for them, and I hope it encourages more studios to take these sorts of chances. Next, we've got a really obscure one, Odd Gods by In Between Worlds. Not to be confused with the series of children's books that apparently share the same name. I've actually had this one on my watch list since I first started the channel back in 2017, because it's very much the retro 80s or 90s style of anachronistic science fantasy that I really find appealing. Just the art alone evokes images of Time Bandits or House 2, for anyone who's seen that, or a grittier version of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Right off the bat, I will say they've really been slow-boiling this one, and info is still pretty scarce. The general idea is that the player will assemble a party of regular 90s stereotypes with classes like goth or jock or nerd, and somehow end up traveling through time and alternate dimensions as part of a surreal but gritty and challenging tactical campaign. They're aiming for a 12-hour campaign with branching paths and multiple endings, and the interesting decision to run with a no RNG combat system, which could be hit or miss. I mean, we'll have to see how that turns out. I mean, I'll be honest, I have absolutely no idea what this game is going to look like when it does come out, or even if it will ever come out. But I am definitely keeping an eye on it. I mean, come on. The alignment systems use rock genres like mainstream or alternative, instead of more basic alignment concepts like good and evil. How could I not want to play this? Next we've got Stirring Abyss by Sleepy Sentry, K Project, and Slitherine Limited. This one is one that I actually did mean to talk about last year. I actually had a partially finished overview video that ended up getting eaten when my old computer exploded. After that, development seemingly collapsed, so I didn't bother trying to remake that video. But then it got picked up by a new publisher, and it actually ended up launching earlier this year, which then made the work-in-progress overview video moot anyway. It's a pretty straightforward roguelike with a fascinating concept. The player takes control of the surviving crew of a Cold War-era submarine that's trapped at the bottom of the ocean, racing against Soviet scientists to uncover the secrets of a monster-infested sunken city. It has a very striking art style and an interesting story that you can discover through various lore items, as well as the staples you'd expect from this sort of game: madness and mutations. I will say, I've actually played this game a fair amount since it came out a few months ago, and I do feel like it's decent, but it's a little too repetitive. The maps all kind of blend together after a while, and there aren't enough abilities or branching paths or enemy varieties to give it much replayability. But it is still a fascinating experience, and I'm glad that they actually made it out to launch, despite their earlier funding setbacks. I don't know if I'm ever really going to do any videos on it at this point. It's a few months old, and I don't know how well suited it would be to an actual series. But I am hoping to see more from these developers in the future. I'll leave it at that. Next up, we've got The Hand of Merlin from Room C Games, Crow Team, and Versus Evil. This one is a turn-based tactical roguelite set in an anachronistic mashup setting combining elements of Arthurian legend with full-scale celestial horror. Much like with a few of the other entries in this month's list, I just really find this sort of mashup setting appealing. Generic fantasy settings have a really hard time holding my attention these days, but this sort of science fantasy with a horror twist immediately piques my interest. On top of that, the Hand of Merlin also features lore written by Jonas Kairatzis, one of the two main authors who handled all that lore in Phoenix Point that I absolutely adored. I should see what Alan Stroud is up to these days. I really loved his writing in Phoenix Point as well. I wonder if he's doing more games. Anyway, the Hand of Merlin is currently in early access, and I haven't really had time to muck with it much, but it's definitely one of the titles I'm keeping an eye on. After that, we have The Way of Wrath from Animal, which is actually a game I recently backed over on Kickstarter. This one is a story-driven tactical RPG set in a sort of European or Siberian kind of shamanistic low fantasy setting with classless character progression and the option to play with either a real-time with pause or turn-based tactical combat system. I believe the general concept behind this one is that the player is tasked with protecting a fortress that's about to come under siege. They have an open world to explore and survival elements that need to be tended to, but the important thing is to make sure that their party and fortifications are prepared to turn back the enemies that will periodically try to storm their gates. Many of the events in the game will be time-sensitive, so it'll be up to the player to decide where they should focus their attention from one day to the next. They can explore the world around them and scrounge for resources. They can focus on building up their fortress or filling out their armory. They can delve into mystical rites that are apt to do just as much harm as they are good. And there are all sorts of morally questionable things they can do to give themselves a short-term advantage with potential long-term ramifications. There are a lot of fascinating options to explore, which would seem to imply a fair amount of replayability. That said, the full game's not slated for launch until sometime next year, Q1 or Q2, but I believe the backer beta is supposed to be just around the corner. I think I just filled out a survey for that, so I'll have to double check that. Up next, we've got Urban Strife from White Pond Games and Microprose Software. though I have no idea how much relation they have to the classic Microprose. I have actually talked about this game before. It was one of the very first overview videos I did way back in 2017, alongside a few other projects that never made it to the finish line, like Witch House and Kingsman. This one, though, this one has fared quite a bit better. It was looking pretty crude back in 2017, but the game's come quite a long way since then. Real quick, it's a turn-based tactical post-apoc zombie survival game, somewhat similar to Dead State for those of you who remember that game. Much like with The Walking Dead or other popular zombie franchises, the zombies themselves are almost more of an environmental hazard. They're dangerous at first, but later on they're more of a hazard to avoid or to use to your advantage, because the real focus is on the alliances and potential conflicts with other heavily armed human factions. I have to say, I peek in on this one every once in a while, and it looks consistently better every time I do. The graphics have improved markedly from one year to the next, the mechanics are getting surprisingly granular, and I am really looking forward to seeing how the final game turns out. They do currently have it slated for a Q3 release, but I will admit I'm a bit skeptical about that. I guess we'll see as we get out towards September. I would not be surprised if they push it back, but honestly, it looks good enough that I'd be more than willing to wait. Which finally brings us to Wartales from Shiro Games. I have had a lot of people name drop this one at me. Apparently it got a fair amount of attention over the past few months, with some folks going so far as to refer to it as Battle Brothers but with legs. Given that I have done like 120 episodes worth of Battle Bros content, that obviously caught my attention. That said, I have played the demo a couple of times, and while I can see the general parallels between Wartales and Battle Brothers, I don't think it's really fair to compare the two. Battle Brothers is very gritty. It's a tactical experience which is constantly grinding the player down with its harsh mechanics and bleak setting. In comparison, Wartales felt a lot more kind of gimmicky and borderline casual. I mean, it's not fair for me to judge it too much based purely on an early demo, but I will say the cramped battlefields particularly jumped out at me as being severely limiting for overall tactical variety. You can run an archer, for example, but bow range is so limited and the maps are so small that you'll get off an average of like one shot before an enemy just walks up and starts beating you over the head with a cudgel. Your guys can get injured, but I'm fairly certain that all injuries will heal over time. Some tactical scenarios can be challenging, but it never quite reached the level of perpetual despair that Battle Brothers tends to impart on an amateur player such as myself. On a similar note, I'll also say I'm not a big fan of time-wasting minigames for things like lockpicking and resource gathering, and Wartales has a ton of that stuff. They've got one for cracking open chests, and another one for picking herbs, and another one for mining ore, where you click on rocks. I just don't find that stuff fun, but maybe that's just me. I mean, personally, if a game's already rolling virtual dice to determine how effectively I can stab someone to death, I feel like it should also just roll those dice to determine how well I can crack open a rock or pick a flower. Anyway, the game does look interesting, and it's obviously still very much in early development, with an early access launch slated for later this year. They do have closed playtests going on, which you can sign up for over on their Steam page. I'll be curious to see how it turns out. But at the same time, I am absolutely not expecting it to be Battle Brothers 2.0. I think that's fair. And you know what? We're running a little long here. I do have Zodiac Knights on the list, but let's stop with Wartales. I've still got a fair amount of other oddball and obscure titles I'd love to yammer about anyway. But we'll get to those next time. This certainly will not be our last retrospective, so there's no reason to try to cram the entire watch list into a single video. And I am making a token effort to keep this thing under a half hour long. I still need to finish the next Wrath episode, plus a special bonus project I'm working on, which some of you will probably enjoy. At any rate, y'all know what that means. It's time to start winding things down. As always, I would like to extend my thanks to you, the rank and file viewers, who help keep this channel running. I know it's easy to overlook the impact of individual views, likes, or subscriptions, but all of that stuff really does add up. I mean, if it didn't, the channel wouldn't be where it is today, with over 20,000 subscribers and a couple million overall views. Sure, the channel's not a massive success or anything, and let's be honest, I didn't go into this ever thinking it would be. But it has been successful enough to help me get through some pretty difficult times. Y'all know what I'm talking about. We've all been living through it over the past couple of years. So, thanks. I appreciate every single click you fine folks have sent my way, as well as all your comments, questions, and even your snide remarks. It's all engagement. I mean, look, before I started this channel, I sank something like 20 years of my life into the customer service industry. I don't have thin skin. I can take a few dislikes or critical feedback, and sometimes it'll even get me to adjust how I do things moving forward. You never know. Don't get me wrong, I have no interest in engaging with obvious trolls, or folks trying to inject unnecessary politics or drama into my comment feeds. Guys, it's video games. But I do try to take the legitimate feedback seriously. I never expect people to be universally positive about every single thing I do or every game I talk about. It's literally impossible, especially as the channel gets bigger from one month to the next. Don't be afraid to make your voice heard, even if your feedback is negative. Unless you really go out of your way to deliberately be offensive, I am not going to take offense. And let's be honest, even if someone does decide to be offensive, I'm probably not going to care anyway. I think it's pretty clear that I'm just some sort of emotionless customer service drone that broke its programming and stumbled its way into becoming an amateur content creator. Went off on kind of a tangent there, such as the hazard of these semi-scripted videos. So back on track. Oh yes, I would like to give a shout out, of course, to the Raiders, the fine folks who take that extra step to financially support the channel through PayPal or Patreon. It's thanks to folks like them, of course, that I can continue spending so much time working on these video projects, instead of returning to my former life as a mindless customer wrangling automaton. I believe we're covering a 3-month period this time around, so with that in mind, I'd like to give a special thanks to the honorary Raiders from May, June, and July. That would be Alexander Hawkbaum, Austin Fagan, Benjamin Gray, BGBNG, Bose77, Brad Quinn, C1S, Commissar Moody, Comrade Robot, CRX-CRVS, Ego2, Ethan Vonderweed, Flamebeard, Glenn Jensen, ICU Uwu, Mark Giemza, Maximilian Monk, Misha, Neurolancer, Oil of Hope, Peter Clayson, Rob H., Roman Berger, Scott Brown, Sir Dialot, The White Winter Wolf, Vertigo 322, and Victoria Babenko. And of course, I'd like to give an extra special thanks to the veteran raiders from that same general time period. Adri Raven, Aloise, Drakith, Erie V23, Eric Teichmiller, James Tremiere, Jace Orkblood, Jeffrey McKins, Kazorm, Lady Shayna, Laura and Mike, Leroy Nukinson, Lulalu, Lek Nishender, Max Robespierre, Nyolo Conte, Nerd Professor, Nod Goblin Nico, Optimal 2, Raximus Savage, Sensei Yums, Sean Orpin, Stoltz, Terry Williams, The Link King, The Book Thief, Thomas K. Arata, Thomas Pietkowski, and Woe77. And I suppose I should give some token acknowledgement to the Raider Elite, the captains and commanders like Revenant, Anerdinwarpaint, Antonio Hernandez, Dragon Matrix 7, Exsellsior, Lima, Nathan Welch Jr., and Valinrook, who continue to astound me with their incredible generosity. Seriously, you guys are amazing. And not, of course, that I want to belittle anyone's contribution. I don't expect anyone to give me money for yammering about video games, so the fact that there are, in fact, people who enjoy my content enough to financially support it like this is nothing short of incredible. That said, if you have made it this far into the video and you would like to join the illustrious ranks of the Raiders, then feel free to check out the links to my PayPal or Patreon accounts down in the description below. YouTube's also got this weird new tip jar or applause button or clap button or whatever it is that they're calling it this month, which allows people to directly tip content creators for videos that they particularly enjoy. So that's always an option for folks who just want to do a one-time thing. As always, this is still a pretty tiny channel, and we're very, very far away from being able to do any serious rewards, but I do try to give the Raiders some assorted perks and benefits for their contributions. I do semi-regular blog posts and polls over on the Patreon. I toss them the occasional early video links, and sometimes I even end up playing games where I can draft them into my squads or rosters, and send them to an ignominious and tragically avoidable death. Granted, it's been a while since I've gotten to do that, but we do have games like Cyber Knight's Flashpoint and Xenonauts 2 to look forward to. Not to mention whatever Firaxis throws at us next. It's just a matter of time. If that sounds like something you might enjoy, then feel free to check out those aforementioned links. If not, no big deal. I certainly don't take it personally. Like I said, even the rank and file viewers help get the channel to where it is today. And I appreciate the heck out of y'all for doing that. With all that said and done, this is Retcon Raider, signing off. Thanks for listening. And remember, if you need to contact me for any reason, feel free to leave a comment on any one of my videos. Or you can reach me on Discord, Facebook, Patreon, Twitter, or at my official email address. As always, links are in the description.